This is the story of a woman from a quite old prophecy which said that Scotland would rise with Mary and fall with Mary. This is the story of the richest woman in Western Europe and wasting her enormous wealth on a mirage which, contrary to appearances, had minimal chance of ceasing to be a delusion if the game had been played well, but it was played badly. A perfect story for books, movies, but above all, a perfect demonstration of what results from choosing the wrong strategy, and life is always a strategy. The series Outlander talks about the money Louis XV sent to the Jacobite uprising. This legendary treasure has been lost. That's right, but it wasn't exactly Louis XIV or XV's money. They weren't stupid enough to sponsor something that might fail. Louis did not send his money, it was really not so much, and the money that in a sense belonged to the Scots. It was the Sobieski estate. In a sense, the gold acquired by the Ottomans was given to the heir. The Sobieskis became impoverished for a mirage. Today they live just like the Ottomans in France. It's a joke of fate. The income from the leases amounted to 600 livres, they were invested in the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. To this should be added the income from the estates in Cholet, amounting to 70,000 hectares and 6,000 farms, and compensation for the election from Frederick Augustus I 25 million livres. Dowry jewels of the Sobieski family, including the famous rubies the size of a pigeon's egg. And her father's fortune after his death. These sums were spent on unsuccessful uprisings to regain the throne. Part of the dowry also consisted of debts of the Republic of Poland for rejecting a candidate for the throne during the election for Augustus II, and this money was practically impossible to recover. According to yet another legend, all the women depicted in A. Pen's paintings were enchanted in his paintings. They were supposed to be unhappy throughout their lives and even descend from the portraits as ghosts after death. Anne Orzelski, the cursed lover of Frederick the Great, who never loved another woman again. Marie Lashinska, whose story probably needs no introduction. Teofila Zolderska-Potolicka, a mysterious countess who imported mulberries and founded the first silk factory in Poland. And finally, Marie Clementina Sobieski Stuart, the last Queen of Scotland. One of the forgotten queens. The richest princess in Europe, without whose money events such as Culloden Moor would not have happened. A mysterious woman who will always remain somewhere in the background, although she frequents the most distinguished courts and was related to the most powerful. A woman blamed for a lot, but in reality she did not have that much influence on history. A mismatched marriage, definitely yes. Marie Clementine Sobieski is the daughter of James Sobieski, granddaughter of John III Sobieski. John Sobieski became famous for the Second Siege of Vienna, where he commanded together with Eugene de Savoy and Charles of Lorraine. He interfered in the military conflict between the Habsburgs and the Porte during the reign of Mehmed IV, son of Turhan Khan and Ibrahim. After the Second Siege of Vienna, Murad will lose his throne and be imprisoned in cafes. Unfortunately, Turhan is no longer alive. Which clearly shows that the Yenicheri were afraid of the last great Valide Sultan, and that was the only reason they stopped playing politics. This is their next major military defeat after Socorro. Sobieski, as he himself said, did not consider reading to be a necessary art, nor political science. Today we can safely say that it was to his own detriment, because not only did dynastic plans come to ruin for fear of bringing too influential people to the throne, but also he thwarted France's elaborate plan, which will lead to the future his country will disappear from the map. However, he couldn't know about the latter, but he did know about the former. How it really happened with the legendary Second Siege of Vienna. Well, France and the Ottoman Empire have always concluded secret treaties when they want to arrange matters on the continent according to their wishes. This unwritten alliance continues to this day. Contrary to appearances, these changes were more often positive than negative. The power of the von Habsburg family is growing. They begin to rebuild the Holy Empire, which is a thorn in the side of Louis XIV, but not only in his side. He realizes that this will destroy the fragile peace arrangements on the continent and introduce a new balance of power. The plan was simple and wise indeed, if not for the Polish king. France wants to declare war on the Habsburgs, but it is perfectly aware that it cannot achieve anything on its own. A two-front fight is always much more advantageous for the aggressor. Even if then the rights to peace treaties have to be shared. Contrary to a rather stupid saying, it is not worth taking the bull by the horns. Wang Yi, a brilliant strategist at the time of the unification of China, noticed something very important about this saying. The strategist stated directly that he had not seen a tiger attacking an ox from the front, but did it from the back. No predator attacks from the front, and therefore ungulates have a different range of vision, also directed backwards. Nature, as always, is smarter than people. Bourbon's plan is similar. The rear is to be secured by the Ottomans, who conclude a secret agreement with Louis. Both countries are not in favor of the strong Habsburg family, which at that time has France in its clutches. Only with time the grandson of Louis XIV will take the throne of Spain, is a threat to the Ottomans, and is mercilessly rich thanks to its colonies, which means it can sponsor wars indefinitely. Unfortunately, John III Sobieski absolutely did not see this problem, which even Russia and Scandinavia, which was of little importance at that time, were beginning to see. Britain is also keeping a close eye on the Habsburgs, although the conflict of interests with France will soon take over. The Ottomans were invited by France, which wanted to weaken the Habsburgs' influence and create a second war front and join the Ottomans after the siege of Vienna. It is true that the Second Siege of Vienna was definitely a victory for Sobieski and the skill of the Polish hussars, although the Polish king returned to the country and Eugene de Savoy fought for several more years. No wonder they love him more in Austria than the commander of one battle who resigned from the entire war. Eugene de Savoy knows perfectly well the plans of the King of France. He was supposed to change the front when the right moment came, but he had to change his plans. Unlike Sobieski, Eugene likes to read. He will play this game to his advantage. He will stand in the shadow as the victor of the Turks, while using his brother as a puppet to start the process of Italian unification. Over time, his hometown of Turin will become the first capital of United Italy. Sobieski returned to the country a rich man thanks to the spoils of war. With wealth and a position that, over time, his brethren will begin to envy him. In this country, a ruler who counts on the international arena and has something to say is not welcome. The nobility want someone who will fulfill their whims without criticism. Liberum veto is going crazy, and although some people feel offended by one comedy series, it largely revealed the truth about what was happening in this country at that time. Could Mary Clementine really be so dangerous and destroy Anglicanism? Many British historians say so, which results from the centuries-old tradition of a culture of fear of Catholics, but Anglicanism is so deeply rooted that it would be impossible to eradicate it even in the times of James. James Stuart had more Protestants than Catholics around him, which displeased several of those sitting on Peter's throne. They sponsored his court. Clementine managed to remove the Earl of Inverness, but the reason was not the confession. Clementine was not Mary Tudor, and times were different. Religion is here to stay and stacks are no longer so fashionable. Initially, King James VIII of Scotland, known in England and Ireland as James III, sought the daughter of Tsar Peter the Great of Russia. However, Peter quickly realized that this marriage was not very profitable, and he sent the delegates to Spain, where the king was staying. Moreover, Jacob is in love with the daughter of his uncle Reynaud III d'Este. Perennial Jacobite uprisings strain his budget. This is how the idea of marrying the daughter of the godson of Louis XIV and goddaughter of Clement XI was born, which in the eyes of James Stuart, who was a Catholic at last and applied for help from the Vatican, but was actually a kept man of this state, could improve his position. Certainly, Clement XI also saw this as a good opportunity, as he may have hoped that, through Mary Clementine, after the king's return to the throne of Scotland, he could have an influence on restoring process of Catholicism to the islands. James III, however, was in favor of religious tolerance, and there were many indications that he would not change this decision, even though Catholicism was the reason why his father had to leave the country. James was the perfect excuse. Let's not forget that it was officially him who was the cause of the War of the Spanish Succession, in which Eugene de Savoy also took part. Today, no one hides that he helped Joseph I leave this world. Savoy has expanded its territories, and no one doubts that the Risorgimento is beginning. Thanks to this, the Bourbons took over Spain and, in fact, it was mainly about this. The grandson of Louis XIV sat on the throne. Marie Clementine's mother was Hedwig Elizabeth, Princess of Bavaria of Neuburg, aunt of Emperor Charles VI, who was bound by a pact with George I. In fact, he was dependent on England, because he received the Spanish possessions in Italy, which he could not defend without a fleet, and this fleet is English. The role of Hedwig Elizabeth was specific. On the one hand, she was an almost invisible person, on the other, she was undoubtedly the springboard of many activities that helped not only her husband, but also the entire family. Marie Casimir d'Arquien appealed to her daughter-in-law's help when trying to grant James the Duchy of Piombino, which was not done by the princess's brothers-in-law Leopold I and Charles II. It was Hedwig Elizabeth who was to seek the emperor's help in the marriages of Alexander and Constantine Sobieski, and above all, for support for her own daughters. It was Hedwig Elizabeth who intervened both in Vienna and with her brothers, asking for help in freeing James and Constantine when they found themselves in a Saxon prison. Although her efforts did not bring any significant results, neither Marie Casimir nor Prince Alexander could do anything more for the imprisoned. Later, the envoys of Peter I, who wanted to see her husband as well James on the Polish throne, talked to Hedwig Elizabeth. She was supposed to convince her husband to accept these very uncertain offers. But she elegantly explained that it was the emperor who did not consent to James's cooperation with the Tsar. The princess is the cousin of Charles VI, John V of Portugal, as well as the niece of the electors of Trier, Bavaria and the Palatinate, i.e. the people who have the greatest influence on the election of the emperor. Hedwig Elizabeth was also the person who sought the prince's return to Olava when he was expelled from there after their daughter, Maria Clementine, escaped from Innsbruck and married James Stuart. Hedwig Elizabeth was also imprisoned in Innsbruck at that time, and returned to Olava only after the intervention of two of her sisters, Empress Eleonora and Duchess of Parma, Dorota Sofia. It is worth noting that she stayed there voluntarily, so perhaps she was counting on a conversation with her nephew. Then, for several years, already seriously ill, she tried to have the imperial order withdrawn, ordering James to leave Silesia. On her deathbed, she begged Charles VI for mercy for her husband and care for her unmarried daughters, Marie Casimira and Marie Caroline. Her last wish was fulfilled, because in fact, when we look at this whole crazy story, perfect for a movie, we will notice that the emperor turned a blind eye to the antics of his family. Although he did not officially irritate the British Empire. Hedwig Elizabeth died on August 11, 1722 in Olava in the presence of her husband, who was allowed to return home. The prince wandered around Europe for almost 3 years, and during that time he met his increasingly ill wife only twice. Originally, Empress Eleonora and her daughter, Archduchess Marie Elizabeth, obtained permission for him to come there only to say goodbye to his wife. But eventually Charles VI allowed the prince to stay in Silesia. Hedwig Elizabeth's body was buried in the chapel built by her brother Bishop Francis Louis at the Wrocław Cathedral. This woman's niece was Marie Theresa von Habsburg. James Sobieski was a candidate for the King of Poland. He was a good candidate, but the nobility of the time, which put their private rights ahead of the good of the state, did not want a strong ruler. These famous national freedoms combined with the belief in their own infallibility will forever contribute to the country's historical disasters. And unfortunately, they will perpetuate bad national characteristics. A prince educated in the West and with connections in France, who is the godson of Louis XIV himself and, thanks to his wife, has connections with the Habsburgs, is dangerous in the eyes of the nobility, because he can take away their privileges and concentrate power in his own hands. It would certainly have saved the country at that point and changed the course of history, but no one wants that. Certainly, if he had taken advantage of the later proposal of Peter I and the Swedish King Charles XII, he could have created the country into a huge empire extending to Scotland. However, he did not take advantage of his chance. Marie Casimir Sobieski, the namesake of her grandmother, although she was the oldest, was considered a cold person. But initially she was planned to be the wife of James III, although she was engaged to the Duke of Modena. The middle Maria Caroline married in 1723 Charles de la Tour d'Auvergne, Duke of Bouillon, but was promised to the Duc de Guastalla. She died in 1740, as the last of the family. The birth of Marie Clementine was a disappointment, especially since the couple had a son, John Joseph, born a year earlier, who died. Only the prince's brother Alexander talked some sense into him, pointing out that sons often squander their fortune, and daughters are their support. He was a bit wrong, because the fortune was to be squandered, and Marie Clementine needed someone who would support her throughout her life. Nevertheless, Clementine became her father's favorite, and he certainly made the same mistakes that were made with Sisi. The princess was not prepared to be a queen. The fair-haired, dark-eyed, bright and cheerful princess was a typical fairy tale princess. However, it had its drawbacks that were hardly mentioned. Her devotional devotion was to be her undoing, but the princess had a capricious behavior that was reminiscent of bipolar disorder, as in her exaltation she switched from laughing to hysterical crying. Today, it is believed that the princess probably had an adrenal gland defect or problems with liver metabolism, which influenced her behavioral changes, giving symptoms similar to bipolar disorder. This changing character would not only be passed on to her offspring in the genes, but over time it would lead to her tragic death. This is the complete opposite of a spouse. Throughout her life, she supported Marie Casimir very much, even though she felt remorse towards her in her subconscious. In a sense, she stole her sister's fiancé. James was aloof, which resulted from his unfulfilled ambitions for the throne. The failure of James Sobieski or Stuart to ascend the throne truly led to Poland's ruin, but these lords did not want a strong elective king. There were legends about John III's estate, so it was believed that the dowry would be large, and therefore it would be possible to sponsor Jacobite uprisings, lavish living, mistresses and gambling. The first and last are definitely the greatest problems of this ruler. Even if the legends exaggerated the princess's fortune, this woman was not much inferior to the richest woman in history, Kösem Sultan, but there was a but. In fact, the properties destroyed by Russian, Saxon, Polish and Swedish troops no longer brought as much income as they used to. The prince left a lot of money to his daughter. Her income from French estates amounts to 600,000 livres, and from Polish estates 800,000. In addition, she was to receive 250,000 livres that the Elector of Saxony owed her father, and after the death of her parents she would receive one-third of this amount. But Stuart did not know that the money deposited in the Parisian town hall was difficult to obtain, and even the interest would have to be begged from Louis. Louis protected the princess's property in this way, and it seems that he did the right thing, because both the father-in-law and the wife had one thing in common, a dream about the throne, and although everyone around saw that the path they chose to achieve their goal was a dead end, the gentleman did not listen to the arguments. Unfortunately for the Scottish monarch's envoy, James's brother Constantine was also in Olava at that time. He is a Habsburg spy and does not hesitate to inform on his brother. This, in a nutshell, was the family of the last Queen of Scotland. Without a doubt, of all Marie's daughters, Clementine was the prettiest. She exuded charm, confidence and liveliness. The liveliness that James lacked and which could have helped him greatly in achieving his goals. James's position and his behavior are unclear to this day. The Vatican did not recognize the Hanoverian dynasty, but this is quite significant here, because it must tolerate the English who protect the Habsburg estates in Naples. His residence is Palazzo Il Re, part of Palazzo Mutti, near Palazzo Odescalchi, where Marie Casimir Darchian Sobieski lived until her death. The Stuart family also rents a residence in Albano known as Savelli. Contrary to appearances, this is not Versailles, but there is courtly carefreeness typical of this era. The Swiss Guard stands in front of the door. James is in exile here, but he also serves as an ambassador for the new ruler. This arrangement is strange. Officially, James is Catholic, but he also has a Protestant chapel to maintain the spirit of religious tolerance. There are spies hanging around outside. Their leader is Philip von Stosch, known as John Walton and later Horace Mann. Let's be honest, the presence of Protestants does not please the Vatican, and it slightly spoils the image of the papacy in the era of the Council of Trent, when there is a fight for the faithful. James is a bit of a pain in the ass, because it is the papacy that holds his court, and therefore the Protestants. This is a real joke of history. The negotiations for the princess's hand in marriage are conducted by John Walkinshaw, but apparently the originator of the idea was Earl Mar, who was James's secretary. However, the letter of introduction came from the Duchess's Chamberlain, M. Chateaudoux, who was French. It is therefore possible that it was the idea of the King of France himself. He visits the court of both James and Vienna. The princess is the cousin of Charles VI and John V of Portugal, as well as the niece of the electors of Trier, Bavaria and the Palatinate. It is not known who came up with this idea. Is it Earl of Mar or Wogan? Perhaps living in the residence of the princess's grandmother, James Stuart learned the history of the Sobieski princesses himself. Contrary to appearances, these were not insignificant and unknown people at courts. This story wouldn't make sense, of course, without the legendary Charles Wogan. After the Battle of Preston he was captured. He escaped from Newgate prison with Forster's group. He was related to the Tyrconnell house through his mother, so he was not just anyone. He found himself perfect at court. He was a bold and romantic man, and completely devoted to the cause of his king. He quickly managed to get an invitation to the New Year's Eve ball at the Olava Castle. In fact, it is thanks to him that the knowledge of these events has survived and he will appear in this story all the time. It is believed that Charles, who was in love with the princess, was so in love with the princess that he forgot that he was choosing a wife not for himself, but for the king. When we take a closer look at this story, we will see that this could indeed be the case. At the end of 1717, Charles Wogan, posing as Mr. Wagner, was tasked with finding a wife for the only legitimate son of James VIII, James III, 8, because despite the funds received from the Vatican and Louis XIV, the king had financial problems. No one starved him, quite the contrary, but when Hazard appears, the budget is reduced, and in a sense the Jacobite uprisings were a mirage. When he reached the court of Prince James Sobieski, he met his cousin Brian O'Reilly, who was the military commander here. The latter introduced him to the marshal of James Sobieski's court, a certain Klabowski, and he quickly managed to get an invitation to the New Year's Eve ball at the castle. Charles returns to Urbino, where he reports and even praises the princess's virtues. Rumors quickly begin to circulate around the court that Charles has fallen in love with the princess. James Murray sets off on his second journey to the Sobieski court. A Scottish lawyer, an arrogant, self-confident man who actually stuck to the Stuarts because he most likely knew too much about them, or the King of Scotland lacked the intellect to discover that he was a spy. Murray is a Protestant and this is most often cited as the cause of the conflict between him and Marie Clementine. However, there was a deeper meaning, which is rarely mentioned, and which the Queen could discover while staying in Ambras. He is a spy for George I. He is so good at his game that he is given the title of Earl of Dunbar by James. He will become a teacher of his sons, and James Stuart will not see that the intriguer will undermine the ruler's chances of fighting for the throne. Stuart begins preparations for the wedding and departure to Spain, as he plans another Jacobite uprising. Here everyone plays for their own goal and on two fronts. Murray is to deliver the king's letters to the princess. To this day, historians ask themselves the question, who wrote them? Wogan or Stuart, because they don't fit the king's character at all. James Stuart had numerous complexes. And it has long been known that people with complexes are susceptible to clackers. The family will never be good, because they will not pretend that everything someone does is wise. The Jacobite uprisings would have had a chance if James Stuart had actually become King of Poland, and from this perspective he could have negotiated with the islands or even involved Poland in the fight for the throne of Scotland, which would have created a superpower. Let us remember that he is France's candidate for the elective king, but this candidate is even worse in the eyes of the nobility than James Sobieski, because he indeed has old origins, even greater support from France and even the Vatican and many nobles born in Europe, as well as pirates, because piracy really started with a dynastic conflict. The plan is unrealistic, as the Polish nobility would not go to fight anyone other than each other, but not entirely impossible to implement. Everything would depend on whether the king could convince the nobility to fight for freedom, and for this they fight with pleasure. Of course we are talking about Scotland's freedom. It was a French plan, not a stupid one, but it seems that Louis XV, despite having a wife from this part of the world, had absolutely no idea how the Polish nobility behaved, although his father-in-law was a victim of it himself. Louis XIV was not very interested in this, because it is no secret that Marie Casimir d'Arquien even intruded on him with her requests whenever she came to Versailles, and since her brother was causing trouble, the Sun King actually ran away from this woman and made anything to avoid meeting her. It is doubtful whether the German countries would like to be surrounded by such an alliance, so it is not surprising that they did everything to get a German to hear on the throne. In Ohal, today's Olava, on July 22, 1718, a wedding contract was concluded. James Stuart's representative is Charles Wogan. It is no secret that Wogan fell in love with the princess, and she would be much better off in a relationship with him than with Jacob. He was 18 at the time and had already managed to escape from Newgate with Mackintosh. When this news reached George I, he almost became apoplectic. He even issued an arrest warrant and pressured Emperor Charles VI to prevent the marriage, regardless of the fact that he was the bride's cousin. Habsburg having a choice between war or family conflict. He blackmails Prince James Sobieski by telling him to banish him from the estate in Olava, which he does. He proposes to add £10,000 to the princess's dowry so that she does not marry Stuart, and finally orders the capture of the princess and her mother. It will be set in Ambras Castle. The same one that is famous today for the Curiosum Gallery, where we can see the portrait of Vlad Tepes and Petrus Gonsalves. James allegedly became furious, but somehow he was in no hurry to save his future wife, who was actually led to believe many mirages about the prince. James was more interested in organizing another invasion of England, this time from Spain, this time by Cardinal Alberoni and his mistress. He entrusted Wogan with saving the situation, and he set off for Spain. This is where the next Stuart treasure will come from. The Loch Arkaig treasure, also known as the Jacobite gold, is a term used to describe the large sum of money provided by Spain to finance the Jacobite uprising in Scotland in 1745. Rumors have it that the treasure is still hidden in the Loch Arkaig in Lochaber. In 1745, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, also called Bonnie Prince Charlie, came to Scotland from France, claiming the thrones of Scotland, England and Ireland on behalf of his father, James Francis Edward Stuart. Charles assured that his efforts were supported by the King of France, Louis XV Bourbon, and that the arrival of French troops was imminent. In fact, France had little interest in getting involved with the Stuarts. However, some financial support was provided by Spain and Pope Benedict XIV. Spain pledged to contribute 400,000 livres a month to the Jacobite cause. However, delivering this money to the insurgent army was difficult. The first installment, sent by Charles's brother Henry, living in France, was sent in 1745. The French sloop Hazard, renamed Prince Charles, safely made landfall on the west coast of Scotland. Unfortunately for the Jacobites, the wealth was captured shortly afterwards by members of Clan Mackay, loyal to King George. But these are not the times yet. The trip was to take place in the second half of September. Jakub had no idea that the Habsburgs already knew about these plans, but Princess Hedwig added salt to his eye. George I has already offered £10,000 if Clementine does not marry the king but the Prince of Baden, and also threatened to break the concert of Europe. Officially, Marie Clementine sets off on a journey as a wife of Marshal of Poland, but the carriage is drawn by 36 horses, which was rather visible. Both ladies are accompanied by 2 ladies-in-waiting who have their own servants. In addition, there are pages, chateaux-d'eau, 10 additional servants, and 4 carriages with luggage. This is neither a wife of Marshal's nor incognito journey. The Sobieskis did not fully realize what they were signing up for, or they were not informed about the actions of James Stuart and his plans for another Jacobite upspring. In accordance with the will of George I, Charles VI decided to imprison women in Ambras Castle. His mother, Hedwig Sobieski's sister, bribed a messenger going with orders to General Hester, the commander of the garrison in Innsbruck, who faked an accident, which gave the women an extra week. A week would certainly be enough to reach Italy, but Hedwig decided to stop in Augsburg at her brother's to set the Sobieski family's jewels. This gave time to prepare an ambush. This was extreme stupidity, but this is already demonstrated in the organization of the trip. Thus, the princess was captured and ended up in the castle of Ambras, where she lived in a luxurious prison, being the emperor's bargaining chip. James Sobieski protested, and Clementine sent letters to the Pope, thanks to the help of her faithful maid, but it did not seem to help much, because the Pope and the Emperor were waiting to see what actions England and France would make. In a sense, this is a continuation of the fight for supremacy between the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. Empress Eleonora and Dorothy Sophia de Parma intervened in Vienna. James Sobieski even dared to write to Frederick Augustus I, who competed with him in the fight for the throne and showed reluctance. In the letter, he informed that George had offered him huge amounts of money to give up the marriage. In retaliation, the emperor banned princess weddings in Italy. If so, James truly did not realize that this escapade had to end this way. He sent several letters to the emperor about his daughter, noting that he refused to marry the Duke of Parma, which is why he was forced to choose Stuart. He also noted that the emperor had 3 months to raise objections, and the princess was to return to Silesia during that time. However, he did not do this. Finally, in desperation, he threatens to inform Tsar Peter I. Peter I is quite an important person in this game, although he does not appear in this story personally. He is, in alliance with France, wants to heir on the Polish throne James Sobieski or James Stuart to create a counterweight to the Habsburg Empire, which is in coalition with England. He is an ally of the Sobieski family and is in the opposite camp to England and Saxony. Hanoverian envoys go to the emperor and want to imprison James Sobieski. Charles VI felt stupid, exposed to ridicule, but he had no choice. George blamed Habsburg for everything, even his enemy's departure to Spain. Charles Wogan offered to rescue the princess. He sets out again for Olava, traveling as a Flemish merchant. On the way, he stopped in Innsbruck and contacted the imprisoned, thanks to Mr. Chateaudoux, and then went to her father. Thanks to him, he entered the castle calmly as a doctor. Wogan presented his plan, and on December 30, 1718 he was already in Olava. He was unlucky again, because Constantin was at court with the Countess of Berg. James Sobieski had a lot in common with his future son-in-law. They were both pessimistic about the world and overwhelmed by their situation. Their dreams were shattered. On the beginning, Sobieski didn't say no, but at the New Year's Eve ball, he handed Charles a snuff-box carved from turquoise found in Kara Mustafa's tent and refused to support him. From then on, Wogan operated on his own. At that time, Countess Berg wrote to her brother, the commander of the garrison in Wrocław, to arrest the suspicious traveler, as his presence was related to the wedding of Marie Clementine. In this case, Charles was lucky. Perhaps he guessed that Constantine had his own political plans. Officially, he gave a different route and took a different one. This along with history he described the abductions in a report to Queen Marie Leczinski. One may be tempted to ask whether it was not the penultimate Queen of France who was behind James's wedding plan, and not her husband. In the letter, Charles writes about something else that should make us think. This is a powerful political alliance. Prince Chernatov was to be stationed near Olava. During Wogan's stay in Olava, an agreement was to be concluded with Charles XII and the prince, whom he does not want to name, aimed at overthrowing the system of Europe, because Peter I decided that the insult that had befallen Maria Clementine was a perfect pretext to start a war in Germany, but on the condition that Prince Sobieski will join in this. At that time, Peter I stopped favoring the Wettin family on the throne of Poland and began to look for a new king. The choice fell on Sobieski. Marie Clementine is of course an excuse here, but a much better one than the king, whose crown is unlikely to be restored by anyone from the continent. Charles was to deliver the letter from James. He did not know German, but he saw it as a chance for his king's return to the throne. This could indeed be a good chance. Let's be under no illusions that elective thrones have always been filled with people convenient to others around the world, and the effect of this has varied. The Jagiellon dynasty also ruled on the principle of election, giving the nobility more and more privileges, which will ultimately lead to the tragedy of free elections. In a sense, the sentiment towards Jagiellon was decisive for a long time, but they were not dynasts in the full sense of the word. Someone else could be elected at any time during the election. Unfortunately, Sobieski changed his mind. Sobieski's changeability caused Wogan to act on his own. He went to Sélestat to the Irish garrison, where his uncle Richard Gaydon was staying. He travels as a wealthy merchant, jure. There is also Lucas O'Toole, very tall and famous for his love affairs, and John Missett with his wife and servant Jeanton. They were soon joined by Sobieski's houseboy Vetsochi. It is not known whether he had James's support or acted on his own. Perhaps Sobieski, fearing his brother, refused for show. In the whole conspiracy, Jeanton played the most important role. The skills she acquired as a lady of easy virtue certainly helped her in this. Hedwig Sobieski shows her lack of common sense again, because she has to run away with her daughter. Jeanton is to dress up as a princess and Clementine is to escape in her costume. Everything went perfectly, but the Sobieski jewels were forgotten. This is truly a parody of Escape, and it is safe to say that Charles VI simply turned a blind eye, because he was not that stupid. The proof that Carol simply wants to get out of this circus with white gloves and have all the sheep and a full wolf is the fact that no one is chasing them, even though guards are posted all the time. They moved slowly, because just before the princess, her first fiancé set off on his way to Loreto. They move around as the family of the Count of Cernes, but they switch roles, and in the inns it is surprising that one of the maidens is undressed and dressed by other women like a doll. This conspiracy was downright tragic. Charles Wogan is more and more delighted with the princess, and what's worse, he really believes that he at least saved her from the dragon's mouth like a hero, which we can read in his letters to the king. There is a small problem. James Stuart is supposed to be admiring, but he doesn't. Finally, this conspiratorial procession reaches Bologna, where Cardinal Origo is waiting for them. Here, too, a scandal quickly arises, as the town begins to gossip that the cardinal is visiting a mysterious lady incognito. We are already several years after the Council of Trent, so celibacy has been sanctioned. No wonder the cardinal's behavior arouses gossip. He insisted that he performing wedding of the princess. However, Count Murray comes from Rome and brings the English priest Moss. On May 19, 1719, Marie Clementine marries the king. She marrying Charles Wogan, who's as king's replacement. She goes to Rome, incognito, of course, and lives in apartments specially renovated for her in the Ursuline convent. To welcome her, the Pope sends her breakfast brought by 52 servants. Cardinal Acquaviva presented 6,000 scudies and 20,000 pistoles as a gift from the King of Spain. One would be wrong to think that the princess was staying in a monastery cell. It's a palace in a monastery, but this meeting could have influenced her later decisions and death. On June 15, 1719, the Roman Senate receives Charles and the remaining adventurers as the princess's saviors, where they receive decorations. Clementine is loved, but not by everyone. The Jacobites were not as tight a group as the series would have them believe. James Murray quickly began to dominate and decide who should visit a princess and who isn't. He quickly fell out with Chateaudoux. What is this all about? About the status of Mrs. Hay, Murray's sister, wife of the King of Scotland's Chancellor, who sleeps with the king. The legendary Marjorie. Murray simply wants to raise a queen, or he may throw her off because his sister must remain as mistress. It's about influencing the king. 2808 James arrives in Montefiascone. Clementine arrives there on September 2. Mrs. Missett will not set off as she is giving birth to a son at that time. There is no end to the spectacles and balls on the occasion of the official wedding. As the saying goes, the famous Italian greed often goes hand in hand with the famous Italian generosity, not to mention the love of fun. James presents the city with expensive vestments and a tablecloth embroidered with gold. Clementine's chasuble was embroidered with pearls. Finally they go to Rome to settle in the Muti Palace, the king's residence. John Missett, Lucas O'Toole and Richard Gaydon receive knighthoods. Only Mrs. Missett receives nothing, but her father is promoted to colonel. Charles Wogan becomes a baronet. He refuses to accept the rank of brigadier and become a colonel, which he will regret when he enlists in the Spanish army. In Spain he was famous in the Battle of Santa Cruz. He became governor of La Mancha and married a widow O'Driscoll who had 2 daughters. He corresponded with Jonathan Swift. He had 1 son. Swift even planned to publish his adventures, but he said it would not be wise. It is thanks to these letters that we know what happened on the princess's journey. Another Charles also appears to us in the letters. Quite a false man. He boasts that he kills Muslims and is as religious as the Pope, and at the same time ridicules those who forcibly send others to heaven and do it supposedly out of mercy. Over time, Wogan will be joined by Misset, who will become governor of Oran and then settle in Barcelona. Wogan is two-faced, but yes. This is what we conclude from the letter and this passage. Wogan thrives on duplicity, but he has one weakness. Clementine Sobieski. On June 6, 1719, Prince James Sobieski was deprived of his estate. Versions vary. One says that all family members left, and the other says that Hedwig joined her husband because she was sick. James went to famous monastery Jasna Gura, where he was welcomed solemnly. His brother Constantin also came there, and after 2 weeks they set off for the Russian estate. He found refuge in Augsburg. On December 31, 1720, the future Charles Edward Louis John Casimir Sylvester Severin Maria was born. The labor lasted 6 days. The Pope must use in prayer. Ahead of the times, James Stuart ordered that the entire court, not the women, should stay in the chamber. Clementine miraculously survived, and it is not surprising that she could have fallen into postpartum depression, which no one understood at that time, and even today many people believe that love is born with the belly. The prince received his names in honor of his great-grandfather, who died on the scaffold, as well as the great kings of France, Spain and Poland. Wogan, who was in Cartagena at the time, sends his congratulations. The prince was baptized in the same church where the king got married, and he was baptized by Montefiscone. Cannons sounded in Angel's Castle. 10-year-old Louis XV is said to have clapped with joy. There was also an Anglican chaplain in the Moody Palace, which was well received by some visitors from England, but not necessarily by Clementine. If anyone in this era cared about what we now call image, it was certainly James Stuart, who even ate English dishes. The young prince also had Protestant guardians. Historians to this day wonder how much of it was the king's will and how much of it was the will of Earl Murray. The collapse of the South Sea Company hit many layers of society, because this institution operated a bit like government bonds and many invested in it. What's worse, the Germans, George's lovers and favorites, were involved in the scandal. Even Sir Richard Onslow stated in a parliamentary speech that if Stuart landed on the coast at this moment, he would regain his throne. During this period, a new conspiracy emerged under the leadership of a lawyer from London, Christopher Layer. People of high standing quickly joined, such as the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl of Orrery, Bathurst, Lansdowne, Strafford, Henry Goring, William Wyndham and many others. They took advantage of the moment when George I set out for Hanover on his annual journey. Lord Arran was chosen as the commander-in-chief and, interestingly, the annexation of Ireland was also planned. Ireland is a pretty bad idea. Stuart wants too much. It was first necessary to conquer Scotland and establish their rule in this country. Clement XI died, and Innocent XIII, who did not like Stuart, his mirages, his life, became the Pope. Clement XI died, and Innocent XIII became the paperworker, who did not like Stuart, his mirages, living beyond his means, and especially gambling. Living beyond his means, James had no money to finance the campaign, so he turned to Philip of Orléans for help. Regardless of the fact that the relations between England and France were good at that time, Philip quickly informed the English government. And only the consciousness of George Kelly, who grabbed a saber while burning documents during the search, saved some people. Unfortunately, Christopher Layer was sentenced to death. The Duke of Norfolk, Orrery, Lord Noath, George Kelly spent many years in prison. Only Kelly escaped from prison and became Charles Edward's advisor. When James was involved in the conspiracy, his relationship began to deteriorate. Clementine saw no point in this plot. There were many intriguers at court. The most damage was done by the Earl of Stair, who took advantage of the Queen's Catholic bigotry. During the conspiracy, Count Mar changed the front. Charles Edward's caregiver, Mrs. Shelton, was also a devout Catholic. When the Queen, pregnant with her second son, was in Lucca, James decides to have decision on way of raise his son, without his mother's knowledge. Stuart did not see a threat in the fact that Hay's brother, Lord Kintule, became involved with George I and thus regained the confiscated goods. A delighted Mrs. Hay returned to Scotland but was arrested there. Poor Marjorie need rescue. Historians wonder how James forced Clementine to do what happened next, because no one believes in ignorance about the affair. It seems that at some point in the relationship, Clementine gave up or tried in vain to make her husband happy. However, she could not give him what he wanted, i.e. the state. Clementine interceded on her behalf with Philip of Orléans, because she wanted her to accompany her when Henry was born. The problem arose when James decided to place Charles under the care of Murray and his protégé, Thomas Sheridan. Clementine states directly that the child's soul will be damned. It is not known whether this is true. As we mentioned, she may have known that Murray was a spy. There is also the question of the affair of his relative Marjorie Hay, wife of John Hay, Earl of Inverness, with the king, which was not an invention. It is doubtful that Dorothy Sheldon had enough influence over the Queen to turn her against anyone. They were close, but she was just a nanny. Innocent XIII died, and Benedict XIII sat on the throne of Peter. It is not known whether this is true or whether Clementina already sensed what was coming. In March 1725, Henry Benedict Maria Clement Thomas Francis Xavier was born. After this birth, the Queen becomes increasingly impulsive and irritable. Stuart, on the other hand, believes that these are the whims of youth and tries to raise a wife who is younger than himself. His roles are confused. He is not a father, but a husband, although the age difference is considerable. She removes all people loyal to her from the court and surrounds her with reluctant people chosen by Marjorie and Murray. He appointed a Protestant to be the guardian of the younger prince, which again did not please the Queen. Benedict believed Clementine, and soon a papal envoy appeared in the palace. Clementina moved to a convent. It was also a difficult labor because it lasted 3 days. It was ruled that the Queen should no longer bear children. Benedict stopped financing and ordered the removal of Protestants from the king's district. The number of Protestant advisors began to increase, and let's not forget that James lives in the Papal States and is supported by the Pope. He is wasting his fortune, and another plan to regain the throne has failed again. James moves to Bologna. However, Bologna paid little, so Hay was eventually dismissed and the Pope questioned Charles Edward on the catechism. You can go back to Rome. He's not really interested in his wife. She is surrounded by hostile people and she decides to go to the monastery in protest. Officially, James was appeased, but it seems that he needed his wife's wealth again, of which he had already lost what he had received. James wrote in his letters that his wife manipulated people and was hypocritical, but he himself was no better. He didn't see his wife's illness. Clementine is the first documented case of anorexia. When his wife refused to return, out of anger, he published her private letters. Charles was then 4 years old and Henry a few months old. She was gone for 3 years, and when she returned, she had become a fragile recluse, oozing charm but completely rejecting children. People of that time couldn't understand it, just like most people today, citing a motherly instinct that doesn't exist. And although scientists are starting to talk about it, they are still met with resistance. There is an instinct to perpetuate the species, but not all women have to love their children. There are plenty of reasons to have children, and let's not forget that this woman was in labor for 6 days and 3 days the second. She survived each birth miraculously. In those days, few women would survive such a long procedure without drugs and anesthesia. Today it would also be a miracle. The joke is that Clementine went to Bologna to meet her husband, but he was no longer there. Although he knew she would come. Again Marjorie, or James himself. It's no secret that Stuart grew more embittered and spiteful as he got older. Clementine returned to her husband after 2 years, in January 1728. Hay quickly returned to favor. He knew too much and Mrs. Hay was his mistress. After returning to the palace, James and Clementine exist under one roof but relations were hostile. It is clear from Charles Edward's letters that Clementine was irritated by her children. Unfortunately, Carol's character was similar to his mother. In 1730, Benedict died and Corsini became pope, taking the name of Clement XII. It was a family that was friends with the Stuarts. Clements ridiculed Clementine's accusations. He ordered no opposition to the return of Hay, Earl of Inverness. Clementine took a duplicitous course. She actually learned something about big politics. She learned this from her husband. Interestingly, James was furious that his wife was behaving the same way as him. She used to boast that her children had Protestant teachers, thanks to which she managed to get rid of Hay, who settled in Avignon. He was replaced by James Edgar. She teaches them Catholicism herself. Benedict will become a cardinal. In 1733, the War of Polish Succession broke out. General Berwick also died. James Stuart sought the Polish succession. Charles set out with Berwick's son to capture Naples for Don Carlos. Then the Queen begins to be removed from the world of the living. She surrounds herself with priests and nuns who did not help her fight the disease, but probably out of sheer ignorance made her believe that thanks to mortification of the body, constant stay in the chapel and prayer, she would finally pray for a miracle and her problems would disappear. The last 4 years have been devoted to giving alms to the poor, caring for the sick and huge donations to the monastery of St. Cecilia, where he stays. Let us note that institutions that did not need it often extended their hands for this alms, knowing that the Queen would not refuse and their own budget would increase. In fact, recovery was of no benefit to anyone. The Queen was buried in the St. Peter's Basilica with all honors. For 3 days the body rested on the catafalque. Satisfied Franciscans near Palazzo Il Re placed her heart, attributing miracles to it. Well, they got very rich. France soon stopped supporting the king, so George II ascended the throne without any problem. James Stuart did not become King of Poland. He couldn't bribe the nobles, but he also slowly ran out of things to do. He would certainly be the strongest ruler Poland could receive, but he was a supporter of absolutism, and the nobles could not allow that. Unfortunately, Stanislaus August came a little too late. A huge opportunity was lost for both Scotland and Poland, which was striving to disappear from the map with one step. He rests with his wife in the Vatican crypts. Their magnificent cenotaphs are located right at the entrance to the basilica next to the Pietà. The legendary sculpture distracts attention from them, although they are also a work of art. Whether James Stuart should be here is a moot point. We don't really know what he believed in or if he believed in anything at all. By devoting herself completely to taking care of her spirituality, Marie Clementine paid for it with her life, and her huge fortune was wasted on mirage, mistresses, and gambling. Maria Leszczyński, who found herself in a similar situation, spoke highly of the Queen. Although she was able to find herself in the same situation, she knew what to do. She also gave away her wealth, but she was not so naive and it actually went to the poor. The statement by a well-known search engine that Marie Leszczyński uttered the legendary words about rolls is incorrect. This queen has known poverty in her life and she certainly wouldn't say something like that. She was not active at court, but it was not without reason that she went down in history as a good queen. The second person was Charles Wogan. The sons practically did not know their mother, and their father did not talk about her due to his hurt pride. This had a negative impact especially on Charles. His Jacobite rising may have been successful, but he made one mistake. Instead of declaring himself ruler of Scotland, he attacked London. Eventually it came to Culloden Moor. Marie Clementine was too gullible and you could say that she believed that the lives of princesses were like in fairy tales. Was she that hopeless? We don't know that. Most of the knowledge we have about her actually comes from the enemy camp, and over time, the Stuart couple, like all mismatched couples, began to brutally throw mud at each other. Clementine was blamed, but it must be admitted that she did not resort to such primitive tricks as publishing private letters. The fact that she wanted to remove the spy belies her utter stupidity. She was wrong, but James Stuart was also not a good candidate for a husband. He was also not a good candidate for father. For the king this is a moot point. Murray had such a huge influence on the king that it's hard not to call him a puppet in his hands. The last Queen of Scotland, the richest princess in Europe, smiles at us in St. Peter's Basilica. Her face expresses determination and serenity that she didn't really have in life. It is not known what happened to the huge rubies. Bad strategy and ruin. Nevertheless, it is surprising that no one has tried to film this story. Everything is here. Romance. Escapes. Exile. Uprising. Fights. Political games. Fall. Beautiful outfits. Interiors. It may be irritating and decisive, but the story is great. Dumas couldn't have written it better.